Let's start a little bit the conversation about education. You and I were both products of California public education system going way, way back. And it was, at least as I recall, was in great shape then. Where are we today and what happened?
Well, I promise this will be, I don't want to promise, but this will probably be my longest answer because I just want to set the stage for California education, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. And it's a question that a lot of people have, especially folks who've lived here a long time or have moved from somewhere else and said, I thought California once had these great schools. The best way I can set the stage for you is by a tale of two first graders. The first grader was me, who was a first grader many, many years ago, public schools in San Mateo. The other first grader is my youngest daughter, Julianne, who's in public schools in San Carlos right now and is midway through first grade. When I was in first grade, California ranked number 4 in the country in per capita funding. When Julianne entered first grade this year, California straight up, meaning if you just look at how much is spent per student, was 29th. But if you factored in cost of living, so adjusted funding, which is how we usually look at government funding across states, we ranked 47th. So we went from number 4 to number 47. When I was in first grade, all the action was local. It was a locally run school system. More than 2/3 of the money and the decisions were all controlled locally. When Julianne entered first grade this year, totally flipped. More than 2/3 of the dollars are controlled from Sacramento. Still important decisions made locally, but California is one of 10 states that's a, quote, state-run education system. So it's most of the decisions and funding is controlled by Sacramento, a total reverse of the school system I went through. The third thing was when I entered first grade. I didn't know this at the time, but I went back in the statewide election when I was in first grade. More than 2/3 of the voters who voted in that election had a kid in school, kindergarten to high school. Julianne, the last statewide election, 24% of the voters had a kid in school. Now, you don't need to have a child in school to be passionate about education, and there's so many folks here might fit into that category. But that demographic shift of who is voting in this state, from over 2/3 to less than 1/4 with kids in schools, is another shift. So those three things, the funding, the governance, and then the political power demographics behind that. And then the other thing I sort of add to that political piece is gubernatorial leadership. And this is going to be a bipartisan comment, but you've seen in a lot of states that have done a good job with education, the governor has been a central role. California has had literally decades of governors that have not prioritized education, with the exception of the first year of Gray Davis's governorship. So that's 1 year since 1966. So that's Ronald Reagan, that's Jerry Brown, that's George Deukmejian, that's Pete Wilson, that's Gray Davis, that's Arnold Schwarzenegger. Long time, lots of governors, and with the exception of Gray Davis's first year, education was not their top thing that they was pushing as opposed to other states. So that is big picture. And then I could, not going to spend the time here going through all the details because I want to engage in conversation, but along that time, from when I was in first grade to Julianne's, we had a shift, a lawsuit called Serrano versus Priest, which was intended to try to equalize funding. A lot of discussion about that here in San Mateo County, where we have wide variations in funding. But bottom line is that decision, very well intentioned, shifted the power to Sacramento, where the state said, okay, we need to make funding more equal, so the state's going to divide how that happens. The state government came up with a formula to do that, and just as they devised that formula, Prop 13 passed. And that formula was based on an expectation for increasing property taxes. Prop 13 passed and wiped out that base. So that decision, which shifted things to the state, and then Prop 13, which undercut the funding, were huge contributors along this history. So that's sort of the bad news. The good news, and we'll get a little bit into this, is I think people have realized we pretty much hit bottom in our education system in terms of funding, in terms of results. We rank in many respects near the bottom or at the bottom among the 50 states, and there's a lot of emphasis now and energy from a wide range of folks, including business leaders like Lenny, to turn this around. So while I'm going to share a lot of bad news with you today, I'm also optimistic that we are going to be able to turn the education system around in the state.
But let's bring us forward to now where Julianne's in first grade. Where the governor released a State of the State conversation yesterday, and tomorrow he's going to release his budget. Can you tell us a little bit about where we are today and what we should be expecting, and particularly around the budget? What's that look like?
First of all, and I want to balance the negative with the positives, and sort of kind of, brewery here. We want to have a good time and not get totally depressed. I'm in a much better mood after hearing the governor's speech yesterday. Not just because he said he was going to protect education funding, and we'll see what that means tomorrow at 11:30 when he unveils the budget, but the language he used in terms of priorities and the future were things that we've been fighting for a long time to get our state leaders to say, and those were his words in the State of the State. So tomorrow he's going to unveil his budget, then of course the legislature responds and they fight and yell and scream and don't do a lot and finally come up with the budget sometime this summer or later. But if he means protecting education, what that will mean is no further cuts this year. But as we're all aware, last year education in this state was cut significantly. And so even though we have more kids, and normally on the natural education funding would increase each year because a little bit of cost of living and then plus more kids are in this state, we're spending $4 billion less now than we were a couple years ago, which is unheard of in that usually there was a natural increase every year because more kids and things are a little bit more expensive. So there were massive cuts last year. The only thing that kept it from being an utter disaster was the federal funding coming in. So we're pretty much at a low point now where we were in the late 1980s when we're basically looking at being one of the very lowest states in funding. California last year, while every state was suffering, California cut education to a much greater degree than any other state. So last year's budget was a disaster for education. The good news is there's a lot of fear that the governor was going to propose further cuts this year, and we'll find out tomorrow, but it looks like at the moment that won't occur. I should note, I want to give Governor Schwarzenegger some credit. If he did say he was going to cut education more, the federal dollars that are coming into the state are conditioned on a requirement that we don't cut money more. So if he had proposed cutting it, we would have had to get a waiver from the federal government to do further cuts.
So let's talk a little bit about that federal-state relationship. You mentioned money that came in stimulus in the short term, but one of the other things that happened earlier this week was the passage of a set of things that makes California at least potentially eligible for some of the race to the top dollars. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what it might mean in the outlook?
When I was in the legislature in the late 80s and the 90s, the federal government was somewhat irrelevant in terms of a lot of our education. We were really involved in trying to get national standards, which some of you might have a question about. So we were engaged with the Clinton administration then. We were fighting to try to get more special education funding from the feds, which they owe us. So those issues were key. But it wasn't like on a daily basis what was happening in DC was impacting education. And that's changed a lot, somewhat with George Bush and now a lot with Obama, and as a positive. So the race to the top, where the Obama administration very aggressively said, we have some strong views on what is going to help improve schools. And they said in order for states to be eligible for these federal dollars, this race to the top dollars, you're going to have to comply with that. And that includes really trying to get at how well teachers are teaching and be able to use data to measure how teachers are teaching. Somewhat of a basic concept, but not something that has been done in education. And then really allowing for more a choice and a real focus on what's happening with schools that are struggling. I don't like the word failing school, but that is a big focus of the Obama administration. So they had some very strong views, some controversial, and we can get into those tonight. And they said in order for a state to be eligible to apply for Race to the Top funding, you need to make these changes. And so this state, California, passed that legislation this week. You can argue they went a little further than they needed to, which is why it got more controversial than it needed to. Some of the provisions allowing parents to transfer out of any school, the state didn't need to go quite as far to be eligible for Race to the Top funding. But anyway, that was all pressured by the Obama administration. And then the other thing the Obama administration has done is this measure I mentioned, where they're holding states to keep their education funding constant if they want to keep getting federal money. So the federal government's very involved, and if you agree with what the Obama administration is saying, that's a positive. If you don't, their involvement might trouble you a little, because we usually don't think of the federal government being that involved in K through 12 in local schools.